Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from around the world. Welcome back to Creation Conversations, where today we are doing a question and answer special. So it would be great to see some good interaction in the chat this evening as we delve through some of the questions which have been asked on previous broadcasts that we haven't had a chance to get around to. We collect up all of your questions and keep a record of them, which means that when it actually comes round to these Q&A specials, we can go back and deal with some of them. But we do like to have live interaction as well. So do get your questions in around any of the topics that we've spoken about previously, or the creation, evolution, fossils, dinosaurs, and all the rest of the topics in general. Get your questions in now as we go through, because we have most of the full team tonight. We, as of yet, have not got Sam, but we may or may not have him as it goes on. But we do have Dr. Dianiga, we do have John Mackay, we have Craig Hawkins, we have Dr. Glenn Wilson, and of course myself. Although I have to say I am slightly weary from a very large conference that I've arrived from home from just about an hour and a half ago. So we'll see how tonight goes. I've got my coffee ready, so we should be all right. Anyway, how are we all doing tonight on this Q&A special? John, how are you doing? What's been going on in the world?
Well, we've had a busy time at Jurassic Ark, and we had two interesting questions to sort of stimulate the night. The first one, just straight off the cuff without any subject was told, was what shape do you think the Earth is? Is it flat? What about Antarctica? Now, this is becoming a more and more common question without any motivation at all. And the second one was, we started the day with our strata machine, you know, our famous machine now, or infamous, depending on your point of view, that generates strata, and you can see it going sideways, layer upon layer, and multiple layers at the same time. It's a fabulous machine. But the people who were there, not geologists at all, when we were pointing out that the bottom layer on this side got there before the bottom layer at the other end, so the layers simply were different ages along the strata, and then they could see, well, hang on, we saw all those layers forming basically at once. So does that mean the whole geologic column is wrong? And I thought, wow, that's a pretty quick conclusion to reach from people who'd never been to Jurassic Ark before, are not followers of our ministry, came across us on Google Maps. Thank you, Google Maps. And just turned up. They wanted to see because they were a Christian family and they needed to sort out lots of issues. So we had two great questions just come out of a group at Jurassic Ark yesterday. So keeps me busy, keeps the team busy, and it's a great way to start a Q&A day.
Great stuff. No, it sounds good. Sounds good. Diane, did I see that a newsletter came out recently?
Yes, we did send out a newsletter this week, and so you can read about interesting things like giant salamanders and ammonites and Archaeopteryx buried together. And the evolutionists asking the wrong questions because they're obsessed with how old the fossil is, and they forget the obvious thing as to how come these two things got buried together. Ammonites live in the bottom of the sea and they're all extinct now, and well, so is Archaeopteryx, but it was a flying bird.
Yeah, no, it's good stuff. Craig, how are you doing? What's been going on in your neck of the woods?
Yeah, g'day, Joe. Really well. Thank you. I have been getting the museum ready for our sort of main opening season. Has basically started yesterday. We start to open 6 days a week again now. So that keeps us pretty busy. We need more volunteers. If there's anyone out there that are listening from Tassie, let us know. But yeah, went to a men's night last night and spoke at that, about 60 men. I guess you can judge the success of that by how many questions came at the end of it, which was impromptu, but had quite a few questions come up. And yeah, it was a great night. Had a big school group or two come through the museum. Been keeping busy with that.
Good.
Great stuff. Great stuff. Glenn, how are you?
Doing good. I've got the first posters for our mobile museum, if I can get it straight. Just sent them out for test print. and just get them back, look at them, see what they look like, and see if there's changes. And this is going to be have the graphic artist look at it, and there'll be a few changes to these to make some things highlight a little bit better. But we're well on our way, ready to go to the printer and start producing.
I'm looking forward to seeing them.
And Glenn, remind the audience what those posters are for.
So what we will have is a trailer that we can pull up to a business, get permission from the owners to set up in their parking lot. And outside the trailer, we will set up a table under a canopy, have in the back of the canopy a big 7 days of the creation week. And then we'll have a table we'll sit at with fossils, different displays, and have these posters. And each time we set up, we'll have a different specific target subject that we want to address, whether it's going to be on DNA or it's going to be on, dinosaurs. We'll have displays that go with the posters. So we're not going to try to cover, all the subjects of creation research, but each week have a little bit different focus on what we display and what we answer. But the whole thing is to point people to the need for the gospel. That's the purpose.
Amen. No, sounds good. Sounds good. Well, like I said, I've been at a big youth conference for the last 3 days. Arrived home an hour and a half ago or so, and rushed to get ready for Creation Conversations. And we're packing up. We've got our museum open tomorrow here in Oswald Street, and then we're packing up again tomorrow to go out Sunday afternoon after church to another homeschool conference. So busy times. But one rather exciting thing, which has been delivered to our museum just today, is this thing. And I'll hold it up, John, and perhaps you'd like to tell people not only what this is, but also the story as to behind how we actually ended up with this here at the museum.
We got one of these.
Are you there, John?
Yes, Joe. I missed the conversation there because your voice hid behind the.
All right, sorry. I was just going to say, perhaps you'd like to explain why we've got this and why it's at the museum.
Okay, great stuff. We have a two-dimensional picture of this, the original one. It's Draco Rex Hogwartsia, in fact. And when they first found this, it was donated to a children's museum. And it's called Draco Rex because Rex means king and Draco means dragon. And you can see from its horns that it really does look like a dragon. And they gave it a species name of Hogwartsia because the namers were thinking of Harry Potter, Hogwarts College, flying dragons, etc. But in reality, the man who named the dinosaurs originally was convinced that they were dragons. So we're not far from where we actually first started with our study of dinosaurs. These are great 3D casts and great coloring too, Joe. Of course, the jaws aren't fixed in place yet, and the original ones would have not come apart like that. But we're grateful for these. Ourselves and Vance Nelson and a couple of others have sort of chipped in together to order a bulk load of these, and they've just arrived in England, plus GST and all these other things. But it's really great to have them as part of our dinosaur display. And Joe, I believe you have one for us and one for the Tasmanian Discovery Centre.
I have 3 in total, so one for the UK Museum here. Yes, indeed, one for the Tasmanian Museum and one for you. And do pray and donate so that you can fund my plane ticket out to Australia. So not only can I come and preach out and do research in Australia, but I can also bring all this wonderful fossil collection that I've been banking up for you for a little while now, John. So there we go. Great stuff. Well, let's dive into some questions. It's great to see that there's already questions coming into the chat, and it's good to see everybody who's joined us so far. But like I said, we've actually pulled together a whole bulk of questions from previous streams that we're actually going to go through and have a look at now. let's just start with a little comment here, which is more of a comment than a question, but just perhaps because this was a question which was asked a lot in the youth conference that I've just come from. I'm just pulling the question over now as we go through. Maybe we just have a little bit of a comment on this because it is something which I think is quite sad overall. And the comment here, if I can get it up here, is: it's sad when Christians believe in evolution when Genesis clearly teaches a young earth. So let's put that into question form. How does Genesis clearly teach a young earth, and what are some of the consequences for Christians who don't believe in a young earth or do believe in evolution? How about some comments on that?
Okay, well, I'll start because I'm the oldest answerer here. So on the young earth, I've probably got the longest experience of being on this planet. And I'll be honest, this was an issue for me, trained in geology, right? We had a professor who believed in millions of years, and yet he was also not just the professor of geology, he was the professor of the Old Testament. Now, I'll be honest, I didn't come from a church background, and that absolutely bamboozled me, because the one thing I had done was read the Bible, but not come from a church background. As I've said over and over again, I began at the beginning. That's where you start books, right? The first page. You don't start 3/4 of the way through in the book of Matthew like most Christians do. You start at the first page. And being untrained in theology and untrained in church history, the first thing it said was God made the world in 6 days. I couldn't avoid it. It was so different from everything that both my theological professor said, the guy who was the head of the geology department, as well as what the textbook said, millions of years of evolution. What was evident to me was there were 6 days of creation, and the God of the Bible said this. You see, we know he said this because over there in Exodus, it starts the chapter 20, which is all about in 6 days he made the heavens and the earth. And it starts with, and the Lord said, right? So this is what God said. It's not Moses saying, now what on earth will I do to get these people theologically consistent? I know, I'll dream up a story about 6 days of creation. This attributes the whole of the 6-day account to the Lord God, and it includes a statement in the 10 Commandments about how you must tell the truth, right? So you can't avoid it. The Bible teaches 6 days of creation. My reaction, then I'll throw it open to other people. I thought, this is one for the too hard basket. My professor demands millions of years in my answers. The Bible teaches 6 days. I'll just hope it goes away. Now, that's what I did for many years, and I left this question alone. I'll be honest, it was probably the last question about the issue of creation evolution that I sorted out. The first one was easy. Graduating in paleontology, getting distinctions in all of these things, the one thing I did know was the fossils did not show evolution. I collected them all over the place. None of my fossils, if I found a fossil pecten like the one Craig bought me up a few weeks ago, I knew it was a pecten shell because they're still here. And the professor knew it was a pecten shell because they're still here. And Darwin knew it was a pecten shell. That's why he called them living fossils. So I did know that the fossils didn't support evolution. I didn't know about the age of the earth. So I appreciate the comment and the question and the way Joe's phrased it, but I put the question aside, and I'll be honest, it hindered my whole Christian faith because it meant I had to start reading the Bible from somewhere later on if I really wanted to believe it, or I had to say, John Mackay, there's a too hard basket, shove it in there and put a lid on it and hope it goes away. Well, it never went away, but I'll save the rest of the story until a little later. So anybody else want to take it up from there?
Well, I was asked this sorry.
No, you go ahead.
I was just asked this question last night myself, from a Christian perspective. And the way I briefly answered it basically was, well, I don't even need to go to Genesis. I just need to go to Exodus, where it says, for in 6 days God created the heavens and the earth. Story over. For a Christian. That's not necessarily an argument for a non-Christian, but for a Christian, which the question seems to be pointing at, that's good enough for me.
Yeah, I think for me, that's what bothers me the most. Isn't that evolutionists believe in evolution? I expect that, but there's so many Christians that have just accepted that evolution must be true, so we need to reinterpret, reimagine the scriptures. And for me, what settles it is, Jesus quoted from the creation account. The patriarchs believed in it. Paul starts so many of his sermons which a mention of the gospel and creation, ties them together. And I think it's because if you can't trust the first book of the Bible, then how are you going to trust the rest of the book of the Bible? And that first book of the Bible has every aspect of the gospel account. It's where we learn about the original sin. And if there's no real Adam, no original sin, no penalty of sin is death, no promise of the virgin birth, no demonstrating the sacrifice of blood for the forgiveness of sin, which are all in that creation account, then what was the purpose of Jesus dying on the cross? And I guess I go back to, okay, if you want to reject the creation account as being literally true, as we believe, who gets to decide the rest of the book of the Bible as to what parts you believe and what parts you don't?
Yeah.
I'll throw in something at this point that helped me, because it became very evident to me as I read the Bible and I read the Bible. By the way, for those of you who are young Christians out there, get the Bible stored up here. You never know when it's going to be taken off you. In our Western pro-Christian society, it is becoming harder and harder to even have the Bible out there in public. So make sure it's in here. So I read it over and over again from Genesis 1 onwards. I'd encourage you to read it that way as well, right through to the last chapter, Revelation. And it became increasingly obvious that if I was going to claim to believe the Bible, it had to start from page 1. So I actually spoke to an expert, university professor, in ancient Middle Eastern semantics, right? And when you asked him, does the Bible teach the world's made in 6 days? His answer would be yes, right? And you asked him, did you believe that God made the world in 6 days? His answer would be no. And I thought, what? But that was how he actually phrased it. And that confused me for a while until I asked him one other question. I said, you're an expert in all the ancient Middle Eastern archaeology and languages and things like that. And you talk about history, 16,000, 20,000, 100,000, all of these things in your courses. I've got a serious question. All the history you know of, if you took the biblical framework as true, could you fit the whole of Middle Eastern history, languages, the whole lot? Could you fit them into the biblical time frame of 6,000 years or so from Genesis chapter 1 up? He said, yes. I said, you could take all that history and put it into the 6,000 years? Yes. I said, well, why don't you? He said, we don't want to.
So that just reminds me of this story I've told before about one of my students from China who knows nothing of the Bible, absolutely nothing. Never seen one, read one. And I wanted to talk to him about creation, and I asked him, how old did he think the earth was? That was not a good start, because he said 6,000 years. And I said, wait a minute, I'm not asking you what you think. I think the age of the earth. He says, no, 6,000 years. We Chinese keep very good records of our history, and we have 6,000 years of history.
Yeah. And Doki Doki's added a sort of related question in there. Is deep time and evolution a package deal for the secular worldview? Well, it has to be. It has to be, because for evolution to happen, it's got to happen gradually and slowly over long periods of time. So if you take the long period of time away, you're taking basically the idea of evolution away, I think.
As John has pointed out, they keep having to extend that long time longer and longer for the theory to work.
Yeah. And this is actually something that a good chunk of the questions that we have on file are about. And it's this kind of question of evolution and creation, or Christians believing in evolution. For instance, here's one comment that we had come in just here. In my humble opinion, I'm okay with the universe, Earth, and old life, but the Bible is a book that has the interpretation. My focus is the salvation of souls, so I'm okay with evolution or creationism. I mean, we've discussed a little bit about, some of the consequences for believing in evolution, but what about when it comes to the salvation of souls? Is the belief in creation a salvation issue, or does it have any kind of an effect on evangelism?
Diane, your church arena is one that has sort of headed on with this and then gone in all sorts of directions at the theological level. How about you speak on this one?
Well, yes, it is. It is a salvation issue, because what are we being saved for?
Yes.
What are we being saved from?
Yes.
And the ultimate answer is that we are being saved from death. So you need to know how death came into the world. Now, if evolution is true, death actually made us, because evolution is a process of death, disease, and destruction. And the evolutionists admit that. Darwin admitted that. Whereas the Bible clearly teaches that the world started out very good, and death, disease, and destruction are not very good. And in fact, God affirms that by saying the punishment for sin will be death. And it was. So, in order to preach the gospel, the complete gospel, as it were, we need to explain where death came into the world, why we die, why there is death and disease, because everyone knows that that's not very good. And that is clearly set out in Genesis, but it makes no sense in an evolutionary world that says death, disease, and destruction made us, whereas the Bible teaches the precise opposite. And this is where you do have to make a choice. And I had to make that. In fact, I believed in evolution because that's what I was taught, even though I was a Christian. But eventually I could see there was a mismatch. And the thing that worked it out for me was that I went to the scriptures and I just read straight through, not picking out verses here and there, but just read the whole Genesis narrative. And this was when I was past university, so I had been taught evolution. I knew what it said, and I realized I do actually have to make a choice. I want to believe in the authority of scriptures. This description of the history of the world is completely different to what I've been taught at university. I do have to make a choice. Because I was a Christian, I chose to follow the scriptures, and I knew there had to be answers out there. This was a few decades ago where there wasn't much in the way of resources, and I went looking for them. And because it was so hard, that's one of the reasons I ended up going into the creation evolution issue. But back to the issue of the gospel, there is a very clear mismatch between evolution and creation. And so if we are to give a coherent answer to people, why is there death, disease, and destruction in the world? How can we be free of it? And the answer is those things came into the world because of sin, and therefore what we need to be saved from is sin. It's not from any technology or any scientific or so-called scientific thing. It's a salvation issue because it deals with the very thing that we need to be saved from, which is death. And the reason we have death is because of sin. And that's clearly set out in the New Testament. You don't even have to go to Genesis. Go to Romans 5, go to 1 Corinthians, clearly set out that death came into the world because of sin, and therefore you've got to deal with the underlying issue. Just like in medicine, you don't just treat the symptoms, you treat the original cause. So you have to go looking for the original cause. And that's clearly set out in the Genesis account, in creation, followed by the fall, followed by God's judgment. And so the real history of the world, good to bad to worse, but it does end in salvation and glory.
Diane, there's one thing that I think too we need to throw into that bundle, and you and I have talked about it. the churches that don't touch Genesis usually don't touch Revelation either. And the
Yes.
reason is there's a one-for-one connection. So
Yes.
when you look at Genesis and say, well, I'm okay with God using millions of years of evolution, you have to deal with the last verse of Genesis chapter 1, where God said he saw all that he made and it was very good. Now, if you call evolution good, as Huxley said, or even our famous weatherman out here, Tim Flannery, he regards evolution as the real history of the planet, but he also points out that it's the most cruel, vicious, nasty process you could imagine. Now, if your God calls killing, survival of the fittest, death, disease, natural selection very good, then you have to jump across to the new heavens and new earth in the book of Revelation, where he's going to remake the heavens and the earth. Okay, in between, you and I are concerned about the Ukraine. You and I are concerned about, did Mr. Putin blow his enemy out of the air? You and I are concerned about the increasing decimalization, the digitalization of money. We're concerned about sickness and all sorts of COVID stuff, right? We're concerned about that, and we want out, right? Every one of us wants out of that. But if you are talking as an evolutionist, when God remakes the heavens and the earth, and it's once again very good, then you are talking about a God who's going to remake a new heavens and new earth, where you'll die, where you'll kill each other, where all of those things that he used in Genesis, you say evolution, is going to simply be made all over again. And it's just an endless vicious cycle of death and destruction. And you don't call that very good. I don't call that very good. God doesn't call that very good because it isn't very good. So you have to tie not just the bit Diane's pointed out, which is really important, and she's great on that. In fact, we've got a lot of your answers on the website, haven't we, Diane? On our fact file, on our Q&A, dealing with this, but don't divorce it from the last book of the Bible. If you want to deal with end times, you won't get end times straight until you realize there'll be no more tears because sin brought tears. There'll be no more death because sin brought death. That sin is back in Genesis chapter 3. There'll be no more thorns. So you can't get infected in your foot. You won't need doctors. You're out of business, Diane. I'm sorry. But in reality, if we won't need doctors, that's very good. No national Medicare, no taxes. That's really good, right? So when you look, you've got to tie Genesis and Revelation together. But don't be surprised that the churches who deny Genesis or avoid Genesis will also avoid the good news in the book of Revelation. To summarize the whole lot, the first good news in the Bible is actually verse 1. God made the heavens and the earth. It didn't happen by accident. The second good news is we were made in his image. We are the only godlike creature on the planet. That's why we talk and monkeys don't. Then the first bad news, so you've got the comparison, good, very good, and then sin comes in. And God has never called the world good since then, right? Catch that? God has never. You may think the snowy-headed mountains, the purple sky, etc., all things bright and beautiful. Sorry, they are a pitiful, degenerate reminder that snow falls on the hills and kills you, right? Those images we think are great are not. So good, very good, then sin, and then Jesus died, and we call it the good news. And he rose from the dead. That's even better news. He didn't need to do that. We would have had salvation even if he just died on a cross. But he rose from the dead so we could be certain that we would too. And then he's going to make the new heavens and new earth. And that's really, really, really good news. So forget about Genesis 1 and 2, then I'm sorry, you've got no good news to offer anybody.
Yeah. Very good. Very good. Thank you for that. All right. Well, we've got some good questions coming into the live chat, so thank you for that. Keep that coming. What I thought we'd do first is, let me just hide this very quickly, if I can work out how to do that. There it is. What I thought we'd do very quickly is just ask a couple of questions from a program we had a couple of weeks ago on the flat Earth. There's quite a lot of questions that came in. Some of them are relevant, some of them overlap. But there's a couple here which I thought would be worth delving into and having a little bit of a look at. The first one is this question here, which is, there was a comment on the idea of the flat Earth, trying to sort of call out an inconsistency with believing that the world is round. And this is the question here. I've just put it into the comments, and there it is on the screen. The Bible is clear that the Earth cannot be moved, yet you defend heliocentrism. That says we are moving at tremendous speeds. Do you really trust the Bible or mainstream heliocentrism? So first of all, what is heliocentrism? And secondly, do we support the Bible, or do we trust mainstream heliocentrism, or can we support both? What are we dealing with here? Any comments?
I thought you were going to go ahead and answer the first.
Oh, I can answer the first one. That's fine.
About heliocentrism.
That's fine. Yeah. I can easily. Yeah. So basically, you have these two predominant viewpoints regarding the Earth's position in the universe. One is known as geocentrism. The other one is heliocentrism. Helio from the sun at the center, Earth goes around the sun. Geocentrism, Earth at the center, everything else goes around the Earth. And in the past, it got to the point with the geocentrism, which was certainly the predominant model before Nicholas Copernicus, where you ended up having the Earth in the middle. The argument was the sun went round the Earth, and then they began to notice some interesting anomalies with things like the way that the planets behaved with each other and the way that certain satellites and asteroids behaved with each other. So they produced an extraordinarily complex view of how this all began to fit together, until Nicholas Copernicus said, well, if we stick the sun in the center and everything going around the sun, it makes a lot more sense, particularly in light of some of the thoughts that were starting to come around gravity and the way that that works and so on and so forth. So how about commenting on the idea of, does the Bible really teach that the Earth cannot be moved, hence geocentrism, or can heliocentrism fit into it as well?
I'll throw in one comment before the others take over. We can be grateful to a priest who way back came up with a very simple concept of what truth always is. And we use it in science as a principle. And basically, it's called Occam's razor, right? Now, Occam was a priest. And after reading his Bible, even though he knew nothing of the furthest heavens or stars, didn't have a fancy telescope or anything, he said, truth is always the simplest explanation. Right now, in reality, that principle will guide your research if you let it. So that when even Nicholas Copernicus saw all the trouble we were getting ourselves in with Aristotelian this and all the old Ptolemaic astronomy, you had planets doing this and then jumping back and then all sorts of weirder. You can see that in the sky. If you have the Earth as the center, then every now and then you get one of the stars that loops the loop and does that, or loops the loop and then does it back the other way, in order to try and make sense of it if you put the Earth at the center. Now, as Occam said, truth is always the simplest explanation. So when you actually say, let's put the sun at the center, now look what happens. Wow, all of a sudden, the maths is so simple. Now, I asked a guy who designed the guidance system for many of the space shuttles, do they both work? He said, you can invent a complex mathematics that will make the system work. But he said the mathematics for putting the sun at the center is so simple by comparison. Occam's razor again. It works, and it works better.
And what's interesting in both of those, whether it's geocentrism or heliocentrism, the Earth is round. Geocentrism wasn't based upon a flat Earth, which is what this was pointing at. So I think what's interesting to me is that the question embeds a falsehood right at the beginning. And if you start with the wrong presupposition, then you're going to get the wrong answer. And it says that the Bible is clear that the Earth cannot be moved. And then it says, yet you defend this movement. Does the Bible say that the Earth doesn't move? That goes back to oftentimes this First Chronicles 16:30. Tremble before him, all the earth, indeed the world is firmly established. It will not be moved. But you use two different words there in the Hebrew for the earth. The first one is the planet Earth, where it says, tremble before him, all the planet Earth. And the second one is the inhabited world is firmly established and cannot be moved. God's in control. And so, it's you got to look at the context and what's really being said there. So, Joe, Greg.
Yep, thank you. That's great there. That's brilliant. Well, what about this question here, which is sort of along it's a question actually that we were discussing a little earlier, Craig. Sorry, Glenn, about the sort of the fact that this idea of the flat Earth has become so prevalent because we've got nobody to trust to go to. So, how about this comment here? Does it follow that since the powers that be have been caught lying about evolution, then they must be lying about the shape of the Earth as well?
Yeah. I think that's it. I agree with him. I mean, I think we've been really shaken as a society with COVID, and we feel lied to even by the medical professions. And a lot of what we're doing in creation science and creation research is showing that, yes, we're being lied to by many of the mainstream scientists. And so people don't know who to believe or what to believe. And so I think one of our main points is we try to use the science, but the purpose is to show that God's word is true, because it's God's word that's the source of our truth. And so I encourage people to go back to the scriptures. There isn't a single scripture that teaches that the earth is flat. In fact, it talks about the circle of the earth, and the word in the Hebrew originally was a roundness. And so if you're going to say, well, it's a circle as in a 2D that cuts through a sphere, well, then that circle has an edge. We ought to be able to go to that edge and see it. But if you do that, then they're going to say, well, it goes on forever and ever. Well, then it's not a circle, it's a 2D plane. But the word is roundness in the original.
Yeah.
John, you
Now,
were going to say something?
I'll make a comment on the nature of this question, because the one thing I always appreciate at university, I did a course in logic, right? Now, the questions that have been asked there independently are not even related. Does it follow, since the powers that be have been caught lying about evolution? They have, right? This whole program, this whole ministry is based on the fact that I caught my professor out, right? He believed in millions of years, but he knew there was no evidence for evolution, but evolution was there, so we had to learn it because it was in the textbooks, right? Now, to then go on and say, therefore, he must be lying about his wife being pretty. The two things aren't even related at all. And these two things have nothing to do in common. The fact that the government is lying about the price of tin has nothing to do with their qualifications to evaluate, are the apricots inside the tin good for you, right? So these are two absolutely unrelated questions. So in your questions, make sure you've got a connection, not just a throwaway connection that is really a false one. Okay, anybody else want to comment on the nature of the question?
Yeah, I think the powers that be are lying to us, but the powers that be are what Ephesians talks about. Our struggles not against flesh and bone, but against rulers and powers and against world forces of darkness. They're the ones that are deceiving us into believing these things, whether it's evolution or flat earth.
Yeah, great stuff. All right, one final flat earthy type question before we move on to some of the questions that have come in live this evening, and that is this one here. And I'll just share a screen as part of a response to it, but maybe we want to go into a bit more detail as to why the question was asked. But the question is, are there any direct flights from South Africa to Australia? And in response to that, before we comment on perhaps why that question was asked. I just want to share my screen here, and hopefully you can all see this. There we are. There, your trip to Sydney, Johannesburg in South Africa to Sydney, Australia, by Qantas Airways. No stops. It's a direct flight. It's an 11-hour flight, which is a rather significant flight as flights go. And it will cost you a grand total of £1,246. That is approximately $2,500, about 2,000 US dollars. So it's not a cheap flight either. But anyway, there is a direct flight by Qantas from South Africa to Australia, and you can take this flight if you wish on the get rid of that. There we are. Tuesday, the 17th of October. Should you wish to take that for research purposes. But anyway, let me stop sharing. Why was this question asked, or why are flights from South Africa to Australia not necessarily that common, perhaps?
Yeah.
Well, the reality is, my daughter flew from Brisbane to South Africa, via Sydney, of course, but in reality, that's the way you do it. But I wasn't watching your program, so somebody who watched it there tonight must tell us, what was the context of this question? Why would they ask such a question?
Sorry.
I would like to know as well. I've seen online where some of the flat earthers, one of their justifications for it, one of the 200 reasons apparently is the claim that there were no flights to the South Pole, no direct flights to Australia. And I forget what their justifications for that were, but I think it's pretty obvious that there aren't many flights because it's quite expensive, quite dangerous, but there are flights. And my son in the military said, yeah, we fly quite often down to the South Pole because they have research stations. And so, yeah, there are flights to these areas.
Yeah. Usually the flights to the South Pole head from New Zealand down because it's shorter, but it is dangerous because we still have on record the tourist flights that used to go down to the Antarctic till they crashed into a volcano, right? They went down to actually see the only volcano in the southern hemisphere doing its thing in Antarctica. And unfortunately, the turbulence or whatever caused the pole to crash. But I've been at the other end where we take the Great Circle route. If I fly from here to Hong Kong and then from there to London, I don't go across the ocean.
Yes.
It's quicker to go up over the top and
Yes.
come down the other side. Now, for any of you who do sailing, you may have heard that term Great Circle route, but it's something that sailors discovered early, that if you treat the world as a flat map and aim to leave Spain and hit America, then you'll be totally in the wrong place if you go a straight line. Since the world is round, you will have to take what looks like on the map a big curve in order to go straight, right? Because the Great Circle route turns out to be the shortest and the most accurate way to do it. Try it any other way. You can use a flat map, you can use a straight line, and you'll end up in the wrong place. Just ask any military pilot. That's what they do. That's what they have to do.
Yeah. All my trips to China, to Beijing, we fly up to Alaska, cross the Bering Strait, follow the coast down along the Russian coast down into China. And the reason is because that's the shortest route. That curved northern route is the shortest. They're wanting to save money like anyone else. They don't want the expensive route of just going, if it's a 2D plane like we see on a map, they go straight over there. It's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be costly.
And you've got to make sure you've got the right distance to make sure you've got the right amount of fuel. Otherwise, you don't make it.
Yes. And it's enough to make a difference even flying from one side of Australia to another, to the other.
The equations they use are based upon curvature of the Earth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good. All right, well, let's have a few questions from tonight. Before we do, let's do a few quick thank yous. I'm sorry, I'm not going to be reenacting as Sam does, but anyway, we have a thank you from Douglas Buffet. We thank you very much for the £20 donation there. We very much appreciate that. We've also got Lynn Colson with $30, and we thank you very much for that as well. And I think that is it, but I'll have another check through and have a look in a moment. But let's have a question from the live chat, because we've been going all over different places tonight. So let's start with this one that came through from Michael Mitchell, which asked this question here. If death came into the world as a result of sin, what was God's plan beforehand? If he created reproducing life without death, then Earth would soon have become an exponentially growing pile of animals. So how do we fit in this question of, and the same for humans, what about overpopulation if humans were never supposed to die?
Well, it'd be a pretty tough world if they all had kids and kids and kids and kids till we ran out of room. Diane, you're our biologist. You take it from there.
Yes, that is actually a reasonable answer, or a reasonable question, rather. The answer is, well, what was the reproduction rate before death came into the world? Because God is in control of that as well. Yes. Now, we do have a question about this on the Ask John Mackay site. But you have to remember, if God is the one who made life, he is in control of reproduction. Now, in terms of human reproduction, the first mother who had a baby on earth made a very interesting statement. She said, with the help of the Lord, I have gotten a man. In other words, I have had a baby with the help of the Lord. So babies are more than biology. And I think we can say the same thing goes for animal reproduction as well. God is in charge of that. So he would know. He made the world. He gave it all the resources. He would know when it was full. And he can encourage reproduction or facilitate reproduction, or he can stop it. And there are a number of instances in the Bible where God did stop human beings from reproducing, and if you look in the historical passages in the Old Testament, one was particularly when Abraham went down to Abimelech's kingdom, and it says that God had closed up all the wombs in Abimelech. In other words, he'd stopped the women from reproducing. So you do have to remember the God factor. We make no bones about this. You do have to put God in the equation, and it is very clear that he is the one in control of reproduction, of animal reproduction, and plant reproduction as well. So in the overall living ecology, which is a dynamic system, and he is in control of that as well. If anyone else would like to add to that.
I'll add a reference in there, Diane. Psalm. If you read through, if I remember correctly, Psalm 104, it very specifically states, when God sends forth his spirit, the animals multiply. When he withdraws his spirit, they fall to the ground and they die. Now, this is not the biology you learn about in school, but you'll find it's the way it actually works. So when God blessed the people of Israel, when Pharaoh was starving the men from high-rich protein, and our normal biology rule is cut the protein, you cut the reproductive rate of man and beast alike. So he was worried about the next election. There were too many Jews. They were going to vote him out. All sorts of things were his concern. So he starved the men, increased their work hours, cut their protein. And then it says, and the women continued to have babies, right? So God multiplied them in spite of the odds. Now, at the other extreme, you go all the way back to Genesis 2 and 3 and 4, where you read about Cain and Abel. Cain kills his brother Abel, and the Lord actually punishes Cain in a most remarkable way, because his first instruction to Adam and Eve was to till the earth, and Abel had done that. Adam and Eve were doing it, despite the curse of thorns and thistles and weeds that were there already. But he said to Cain, now the earth, that your brother's blood cries out to me, now the earth will no longer yield to you. Now, he could have got the best quality seeds, the highest quality fertilizer, and nothing would have worked for Cain, right? So biology, agriculture, biology, reproduction, biology, animals, and parenthood does not exist without the God factor. So good reminder, Diane, and you and I can praise the Lord that he's involved in it, right? Because if he withdraws, then all of the thing simply collapses.
So it really doesn't come down to just the available resources, but understanding that fifth word of the Bible all comes down to that fourth word, doesn't it?
Yeah. And it is true that, resources can affect population rates. And you can see that when there are very, very sparse areas that become very quickly repopulated after catastrophes and so on and so forth. That plays in, I think, better with things like after the flood and so on and so forth. But there's got to be a spiritual aspect to this as well. Also, remember, part of the curse for humans anyway, not so much animals, but part of the curse for humans, part of the curse that God specifically said to Eve was that her conception would increase. And so we can't just use the modern rates, if you like, of reproduction and apply that to a pre-fallen world, because there's been a very specific change. And so don't fall into the trap of the present is the key to the past, as we've said many, many times before. So,
all right, I'll add one more with a moral and spiritual overtone. When you look at Adam and Eve, the Lord told them to multiply and fill the earth. Now, if sin had never come in, and when we obeyed that commandment, and you have enough people to fill the earth by God's definition, guess what would have happened to their multiplication ability? It would have ceased. And I mean, in heaven, do we have kids? If we did they, whatever, but you can see that this is under God's control. And if sin had never been a problem on planet Earth, once we achieved total obedience to filling the earth, he would have pulled the plug. But there's another side of it as well. They were told to multiply after their own kind. Now, there's a principle here: multiply and fill the earth. Now, when you become Christians, when you become born again, we have the same commandment: multiply after your own kind, right? So can I encourage you that built into that first marriage was a spiritual principle of the gospel, which you would later on get: I'm going to make you are born again, right? Now, multiply and fill the earth after your own kind, and don't stop until you've filled the earth. Okay, so get out there, all you Christians, preach the gospel, preach it with all your heart until we fill the earth with the glory of the Lord.
Great stuff. All right, here's a question perhaps that Craig might like to answer. And before you do, Craig, I'm just going to pull up one particular specimen that I'm going to show our viewers as well. But the question is, what use would fungi or fungi, depending on where in the world and how you want to pronounce it, and other death-regenerating entities have pre-curse? What use would they have? But I just want to show you very quickly. If I can grab it and bring it over, because I've been studying fungus for many years and used to do huge surveys of them and used to collect samples as well. And I just thought, because it's just down here, I might as well show the group. One of the largest fungi fruiting bodies that I'd ever found.
Nice.
Wow.
Pretty sizable thing. It's a Ganoderma australe, which literally means southern bracket. We call these bracket fungi in the UK. I think they're called shelf fungus in the States. I don't know.
We call them snake. We call them snake bread in Australia.
Snake bread. There you go. So yeah, it's pretty sizable creature, and we're estimating about 14 years to get to this kind of size. Based on the growth pattern. So anyway, I just thought that'd be interesting to show the group. But Craig, over to you for the question.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting thing to consider. Are fungi a part of God's original plan for food? And I'm not so sure that they necessarily were, maybe for some creatures, because God said to all the creatures to go and eat all the green plants. So John or others might have a comment on that. But fungi are actually very important in the ecosystems for various purposes, including the breakdown of organic parts. So, you've got animals there eating the green plants. There's going to be branches and bits and pieces falling off all the time. And the fungi are essential for the cycling of those nutrients back through into the soils. Some fungi are actually essential. For example, in the eucalypts, they're called mycorrhizae. They are closely linked with the root systems. They seem to almost help the roots communicate with each other, actually, but also to help them gather nutrients for the plant. So, I think those two purposes are probably the two core purposes, rather than food. In Australia, we've just had a very major case of 3 people that have died at a dinner party from eating the wrong mushrooms. It was cooked up at a Sunday lunch, and one of them was actually, I think, a Baptist pastor that died as part of that, which was very sad. But that's why I raised the question as to whether fungi were actually part of the original sort of food sources.
Well,
But
here in
fungi,
Australia,
like-
Craig, we have some remarkable relationships, particularly in the area that I like to specialise in, and that is food crops and orchids. Now, we have many orchids in Australia that, left to themselves, will not germinate their seeds anywhere above or below ground unless a fungus gets involved and actually helps break down the outside of the seed and germinate the plant. But it goes even further than that, because we have orchids that have to, they were noticed always only within sort of 2 or 3 meters of the base of a tree. And the connection is, if you actually dug up the orchid, these are ground orchids, and you notice from the roots, there'd be fungal threads going right back to the tree. And then you notice there was a 2-way transmission. The tree would provide sugars and everything coming along the root into the orchid, and the fungus would take the waste away from the orchid and deliver it to the tree. And you think, man, that is pretty clever. One needs the other. So they're part of God's original. A plus B plus C actually works by themselves. None of them work very well at all, and some of them won't work one bit. But here's where it can go wrong. Having been involved in crop control and things like that, fungus can get out of control because of either the switching off of something in the major plant that benefits from the fungus. So the fungus takes over and all the food is robbed by the fungus, and it fills up the inside of the plant until the plant is basically strangled, right? It can't survive at all. At the other extreme, we have some plants that have become so dependent on the fungus that we have orchids that flower underground. They never need the sun, but their connection is to the tree further over there, and that tree is getting plenty of sun. So it's providing all the materials, all the sugars underneath the ground to this plant, which at the best, it sort of just gets a few minerals from the environment, but it does not need the sun at all. It's become totally dependent, and all you would need would be one drought, kill off the trees, and that orchid is now extinct. So those are the two extremes of what can go wrong, where it can eliminate the tree or the plant because its balance gets out of control, or something becomes so dependent on it becomes absolutely fragile in its whole structure and can disappear in a single drought.
Yeah. Yeah.
I took the question to be more than just the fungi, that it's talking about the whole suite of microorganisms pre-flood. I think on day 3, when the soil appeared, it doesn't say created on day 3, it appeared, that the good soil has to have a whole population, a whole suite of microorganisms that work within the soil in conjunction with the plants for plants to thrive. But there would be living, dying microbial populations, making the nutrients available, holding the soil together. The soil is an ecosystem, but this isn't death in the sense of biblical death that we're talking about, because the death is in the blood. So this is different with microorganisms, bacteria and such, and we've talked about that in the past.
In
That's
fact,
what I
if you
use the question.
go to the Ask site or the Q&A site or the fact file and search death or search plants or search biome or some of those words, because most of us grow up in school, go to university, get a job somewhere, and find that we are dealing with only the fungus, right? We become experts in fungus instead of seeing, well, without the water, the tree doesn't grow. Without the tree, the fungus doesn't grow. Without the fungus, the tree doesn't grow.
And the
It's
bacteria.
so interconnected, which is why God made them all on day 3, right? The ground comes up, the plants are finished because they're built with that fungal connection all on that day.
Yeah.
And sometimes the fungus will kill the tree because of the upset post-fall world where everything's thrown out of balance. We have a problem in Australia with a fungus called Phytophthora that that kills a lot of certain types of trees and bushes.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was involved in one of the original research groups that looked into things like ash dieback. Ash is a very old and historic tree here in the UK, and a disease came from the continent, which was known as ash dieback, and it started to attack some of the ash trees. And it's got a 2-year cycle where it basically attacks the tree internally, and then the ash has like a long, thin midrib, and then little leaves that come off of it, and then the leaves and the midribs fall to the ground, and then the fruiting bodies come out of those midribs. They look like little tiny golf tees the next year. And I remember at the time that there was a huge amount of panic over this is going to be the end of ash trees in the UK. It's decimating the populations. Then it turns out that a tiny little proportion of ash trees were actually resistant, or rather they could cope with the fungus inhabiting them. And natural selection takes its course, as it does. And here we are getting on for 10 years later. This would have been about 2013, 14, something like that. So about 10 years later, and there are hardly any ash trees dying, because all the ones that have died or would die have died, and you're left with a new population which is now springing up that are actually resistant to it. So sometimes you have these things sweep through a population, which of course is all part of the curse as well. But all interesting stuff to look at.
Joe, our famous Wollemi pine has suffered this problem because it was found initially in a tiny little alcove growing in sandstone with a mild climate, and sandstone having very low nutrition and very specific biome that did not include any of the fungus you find in tropical Queensland. So when they actually learned to multiply it by using little segments of the tree and sort of transplanting all the segments, they grew thousands of them here in Queensland. And yet when you planted them out, the Phytophthora killed them straight away, almost within a very short period of time. And you watched your $1,000 investment just wither away. So we tried it 3 times at Jurassic Ark, and the bad news is, unless we leave them in pots with specially treated fungus-free soil, we are throwing money down the drain. Yet if I go and plant them in sandstone that's low in any of these fungus, they'll do well, right? So it's an interesting situation there that is really related to this question of fungal death.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, a quick thank you then to Neil, who sent in £10 as a super chat donation. So thank you very, very much. We do greatly appreciate that. Let's have some more questions from the live chat then, because they're coming in thick and fast. So let's ask this question here. Perhaps just a very quick comment on this. Is climate change still the terminology used, or has it changed again? Just from my own personal experience, I'll let John and the others comment as well. Climate change is still certainly a mainstream term, but if you go to the extremists, the campaigners and the like, you will find that climate change is not really a term that is used. The one that is most commonly used now is climate emergency. They don't like the term climate crisis because it doesn't sound threatening enough, as I was told by one of the climate activists. So they want it to be a climate emergency, which is actually a legally recognized term. Emergency is a recognized term. It's there with things like terror attacks and so on and so forth in this country. We have the emergency level, which is raised depending on whether MI5 deems it to be dangerous or not. So they actually want to use this as a climate emergency akin to a present terrorist attack. So this is how seriously they're taking it, and the kind of terminology that they would use nowadays. But anyway, any quick comments from the rest of the team?
I thought it was global boiling.
Global boiling, yeah.
Yes, we've had that one in the headlines lately. Yes.
You've always been hot in Australia, though. It's nothing new.
Yeah. Well, we had the interesting headlines in yesterday's paper about how this is the hottest century ever, right, in Australia. Now, of course, being a multi-century man myself, born in one century, still living in the next, I've been alive for most of the last 100 years, right, minus 24. And I'll be honest, we've had hot years, we've had cold years. I was up at Gympie yesterday, and as a boy at Gympie, I remember having to go out and milk the cows, and it was freezing. There's frost all over the ground. There's ice on the udders almost. It was just absolutely, your hands just felt like they were being frozen off as you tried to milk the cow and then take it back to the stall, etc. Now, I haven't seen a year like that for 20 or 30 years. But neither have I seen mega droughts where we run out of water and we are so hot. You've got to sort of sit there with a cold lemonade and a fan and air conditioning and things like that. So in reality, we are doing exactly what your friend said, Joe. We are making this a climate emergency. We're not making it something as if we are part of a cycle. But then the interesting thing is, when you look at the climate records in Australia, I mean, people have been measuring the climate, since we landed? Yes. Back in the 1770s, 1780s, when the first temperature records were made, and it was hotter then. And yesterday they published a picture in the newspaper of Tasmanian Indigenous people fishing, how clever they were when they did this. But behind them, you can see cleared land all the way that was beautifully green. And these early artists were accurate historically. That's why they're picturing them showing the Indigenous people doing what they did and doing it very well. But they cleared the land. And it wasn't in drought. It wasn't in frost. It was just beautifully green like Buckingham Palace grounds. And that's what Brisbane was like, the same. So that you get the old photographs of Brisbane, the town where I live outside of, and it's parkland. So when they talk about destroying the native forest, sorry, this was already cleared. Right, it had been cleared for hunting because boomerangs don't work in a forest, right? You can't even use spears hardly if you're chasing kangaroos through the forest. It doesn't work. So when we are looking, it's the exaggerated views that are being given us to climate change. So yeah, I think climate emergency is the most popular one, but with Craig, global boiling, that's in.
Yeah, very good. Very quick question that has come in from Ravi, which I'll just very quickly answer, and some others may want to quickly comment because it's to do with the question of natural selection and evolution. It says, doesn't the emergence of dieback-resistant ash provide support for natural selection and evolution? The answer is no, because the resistant population was already there. All that you did is eliminate all the ones that weren't resistant and left the ones that were to be able to repopulate. So they haven't changed, they haven't evolved, they haven't designed something differently. They've literally already part of their genetics to be able to resist it. But I know, John, when it comes to things like bacteria and stuff, you can have mutated bacteria that do become resistant to things like antibiotics. Maybe Diane would like to comment on something like that, because if there is a change, if these bacteria have changed and now they have mutated and therefore are resistant to our antibiotics, have they actually evolved?
Well,
Diane?
they've changed, but that doesn't mean they've changed into another type of bacterium. And in fact, they are still classified as the same species of bacteria. They're just variant number, however many you like to have. The interesting thing about those ones that are resistant because of mutation is that they tend not to exist to cope very well out in the normal environment. That they will grow in the laboratory in under very controlled conditions. So out in the environment, they tend to die off. But the point that is being made in this question is about natural selection and evolution. Those two things are not the same. Natural selection is a real process. Selection simply means to choose between existing alternative. That's going on all the time. The example about the ash dieback and the resistant trees is one of them. Most antibiotic resistance is exactly that. The organisms that already have the ability to resist the antibiotics are the ones that survive and thrive. And so in a place like a hospital where you've got really intense selection because of high levels of antibiotics, yes, that's natural selection in action. It's a normal biological process in this fallen world that we live in. But the bacteria are not evolving. The trees and the fungi are not evolving because they are not changing from one kind into another. So natural selection is a real biological process. It is just a sorting out process. It results in some things dying off and some things surviving and thriving in a particular environment. So don't get those two things confused.
Yeah, thanks, Diane. That's a key point there. To give you a couple of examples, because several times I've said I spent 3 years studying genetics and 1 year actually investigating the chromosomal strands of Drosophila and melanogaster. And if you want to go mad from looking down microscopes and sorting out all of these chromosomes, that's one way to do it. But in reality, we had a professor who was very interested in all of this. So we also looked at the evolution of T4 phages, the things involved in tobacco diseases, and you discovered that if it started as a T4 phage, it ended as a T4 phage. These are viral sort of components, and likewise influenza A. If you want to go bored stupid, look at all the variations of influenza A we've got, and over the 70 years they did the study, millions and millions, because this is what it was for. If we are looking at the evolution of man, you got to waste 20 years waiting for the next generation. Yep. Let's take virus, let's take bacteria where they multiply really fast. And if you want to be bored stupid, look at all of the millions and millions of bacteria, or the millions and millions of virus even faster. And T4 and influenza A have turned into influenza A. Natural selection for sure, but not evolution. Change, yes, but not evolution. If you're looking at any sort of change in these, it's a downhill change. No. And tragically, this is one of the things that causes disease, because you're used to the one that you get along with. Anything that busts its outside and you can no longer recognize it, you may end up with a disease, unless, like the ash tree, you already proved to have resistance to COVID or something like that. It's almost inevitably in the population. It's just not triggered till you show. And Diane, the line that you make, we didn't discover about these things because we weren't asking what bad things, what good things do bacteria do, correct?
Yes, that's right. And in fact, the same thing applies to resistant bacteria. When they've done studies of bacteria that they found, thousands of miles away from the nearest hospital, like in the forests of Canada or deep down in caves, they have found within that population the resistant genes are already there. All that natural selection does, or in the case of medically acquired antibiotic resistance, it's unnatural selection, but it is selection. You are selecting something that is already there, and it's just being concentrated to the point where it becomes a problem.
Yeah, I remember our professor pointing out one study where they'd actually got, the old-fashioned test tube type things they had in the 1600s, and they'd sealed them and put soil in them. Obviously, someone forgot about them. They refound them, 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, right up to today, and tested them. And the bacteria in those soils, yes, reactivate them. They already had penicillin resistance, right? It was there right from the start.
Yes, and so it does have a function, and we have written about a few of those studies in the fact file. If you look up antibiotic resistance, there you'll find some of those, particularly about either old soils or in places that are a long way from any sites where antibiotics were being used.
Yeah.
So your point is this is a loss of genetic information, not a creation of new genetic information. And one of the chatters asked, but don't we see mutations in bacteria? Well, yes, you do see mutations, but as Joe said, that is a downward spiral. The geneticists, all find that mutations are always bad.
And sometimes,
create
well,
something new.
yeah, well, it's certainly mutations are always a loss of information. They're not a gain of information. You see, in some bacteria populations, the antibiotic resistance comes from the fact that the bacteria have mutated. As a result, they are misshapen or they do not have a particular feature, which means that the antibiotics cannot take a hold and damage the bacteria. Now, you might think, oh, great, it's now evolved bacteria, it's evolved resistance. Now, it's lost a piece of information due to a mutation. It's now resistant to the antibiotic, but guess what? It's an overall weakened bacteria. It's not actually as healthy as the ones that are resistant. So you're always dealing with a loss of information, and any benefit to the creature or the organism is always only circumstantial. It's a bit like the beetles that thrive on the windy island in the North Atlantic only because they've lost their ability to fly. It's not that they've evolved to live on the island. It's the fact that they're the last ones able to live on the island because all the other beetles have been blown away. So it's a circumstantial benefit as opposed to let's evolve this in order to survive here kind of benefit.
Yeah. It's pretty well recognised amongst scientists as well. It's pretty well recognised. I worked with probably Tasmania's leading botanist, and his comment on natural selection to me was that it was always a process of specialisation that leads to ultimately extinction. If it goes far enough.
One funny comment to finish this section off. When you look at Australia, we have an interesting history of flies flies are just about anywhere in Australia, and the flies in New South Wales and Victoria are the stupidest flies you could ever imagine because they just hover around and settle on you, and you can almost kill them by hand. But we have other flies that are quite fast, and so they invented surface sprays. But we had a real problem with our surface sprays, which are supposed to be absorbed by the feet of the fly, etc., as it walks across the surface. Technically not supposed to be absorbed by you, but I wouldn't push it too far to test that on your skin. But the reality is we found that the surface sprays were not very effective on Australian flies. Now, it wasn't their accent. It wasn't where they were born. It was the fact that they had the thickest soles of their feet on the planet, right? They were a whole group of these flies whose feet were much thicker than other flies. And I had to giggle at that because being of Scottish ancestry and talk to about my own people and how come they ended up in Scotland, I discovered one interesting factor. Not only did my father say we lived way up north because it was far, we could run from the British, right? And there is a truth in that. But if you wonder, how did these barefooted Scotsmen actually get right up to the top where it's freezing cold? It turns out we Scots have the thickest sole feet of all the people on the planet, right? So we can run across the sharp rocks, and it really is true. So these are natural variants. They're not something the Scots evolved. They're probably the fact that, hey, why are you stuck back there? Why has he been killed by the British? He's got thin-skinned feet, and that eliminated the people who couldn't run across the rocks. In the same way as the movie says, white men can't jump, right? The people who can jump were those who could run fastest and jump highest to get away from the slave traders. So natural selection is very real, but it does not make things, it eliminates them. So the point that Craig made was very good. Natural selection ultimately leads to extinction.
Yeah.
Well, I haven't seen your shoes, John. It's more than just thick feet. It's the size, I think.
Yeah. All right. Well, hopefully we've got about 10 minutes left. Let's try and cram in one or two more questions. We've got a question here which is on a completely different subject to anything we've spoken about so far in this program. Muslims tend to point to contradictions in the Bible as evidence that it has been corrupted. Genesis 18, 20 to 21, etc. How can we show that the Bible is in fact preserved perfectly? Any comments from the team on that?
Dead Sea Scrolls are a good starting point.
Yeah.
So, for anyone that doesn't know about that, they were discovered in, I think, the 1940s, Qumran caves, sort of southeastern Israel, and by a Muslim actually, and the scrolls were over 2,000 years old, and basically found to be word for word, the entire book of Isaiah, I think, was found word for word, unchanged to what we had in the modern day. So it hadn't changed, hadn't been corrupted over that period of time. And that's part of the story of the Jewish scribes, who were very particular in the way they recorded scripture. There was a particular profession using the numericals of Hebrew, where they had to make sure they counted the numerical number of each word and each line, and if it didn't add up to what it was meant to add up on any particular point, they had to throw that away and start all over again. So the Jews had a system of making sure that they copied things correctly. There's been some very, very minor maybe copyist errors sort of pointed out, but they don't change the general thrust of the scriptures. And contradictions are a different thing. Contradictions are this part of the Bible contradicts with that part of the Bible, and there tends to always be responses to those.
Yeah, you'll find that most people assume that a spelling difference is a contradiction, and it isn't. A contradiction is where one part of a text says the sky is blue and another part says the sky is not blue, right? Now, that's a contradiction. Now, you'll find that there are none of those in the whole of the Old Testament, New Testament, as delivered to us, as would have been used for the first English translations that have been translated into the words that you and I understand easily. But with the coming of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you can access ream after ream of stuff on the internet now about the Dead Sea Scrolls. And as Craig said, you'll find minor textual differences, spelling sort of things, because, well, we have vowels to make it easier to spell, but the Jews didn't have vowels. So sometimes you find in the commentaries that they put on the edge, they would think, is it an A sound, an E sound, an O sound, or is it something like that? Now, these are not contradictions. They're typography type things, but there's no contradictions. And in fact, I believe there were 10 copies of Genesis and commentaries in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So not just Exodus, not just Isaiah, the most important one, because to speak to the Jews, the prophet Isaiah was the one who foretold the coming of the Messiah, right? So they were very, very knowledgeable about that, and tragically they rejected that because Jesus has already come. But starting at Genesis onwards, have a good talk to a Muslim, and instead of putting up with his claim that there are contradictions, hand him your New King James, and then hand him a copy of the Dead Sea Scrolls freely. Well, not freely, you've got to pay quite a bit for it. Go look it up and say, now where's the contradiction? And 9 times out of 10, you'll find they don't even know what's in the Bible. They've just been told. Same as the skeptics. They don't know what's there. They've just been told.
And ironically,
they don't know what's in the Quran either. So,
that's right.
Well, ironically, Islam has its own contradiction problem, because the writings of Muhammad often contradicted themselves, such to the point that Islam has a system where the later thing that he said is the one that they go with. So there's actually a principle that they apply to deal with the contradictions in his own writings.
Yeah. All right. Well, we've got about 5 minutes left. Let's squeeze in one more quick question, and that question will come from Lynn Colson, who said, is it possible to recalibrate carbon-14, presumably carbon-14 dating, using objects of a known age, for example, are grown stalactites, etc.? Thanks. Well, you probably wouldn't use the stalactites because carbon-14 is something which you use to test organic materials, but the principle really is actually the same. So let me just give an example that I've been involved in. Archaeology very rarely uses carbon-14, radiocarbon-14 dating in order to find out the age of something. It's usually used as a confirmation technique, and the Dead Sea Scrolls were actually a really good example of how useful carbon-14 dating can actually be. However, if you go for something like Egyptian chronology, now Egyptian chronology is a mess. Even the secular historians admit that to a certain degree, right? And there's lots of discussion and interpretation over the so-called dynasties and how they match together. However, one thing that very rarely gets done is any carbon-14 dating. And there's a good reason for that. We don't really need it. There's a lot of written records from the Egyptians. There's a lot of carvings and pictures and paintings and all this kind of stuff, which have their own unique style to each dynasty. And so archaeologists tend to argue over these chronologies based off of the physical artifacts rather than doing something like carbon-14 dating. However, a group of people, and I'm included in that, are thinking and questioning about, well, can we recalibrate radiocarbon dating? A big group of scientists are working on this. And one of the things that they're doing, we're actually working on some of the artifacts that we have in our museum from a known supposed date. Now, I say known supposed date, by which I mean it has been agreed upon by the general consensus of archaeologists that this particular artifact belongs to this dynasty because of the style, because of the way that it's been produced, because of the location where it was found, so on and so forth. So if you can find something that is a wooden artifact, for instance, and we have some wooden carvings of Egyptians from the sort of older dynasties, so from the sort of middle period back to the early period of Egyptian history, then that is something which we can use to test with radiocarbon-14 date to see whether it matches up with the supposed dynasty age. And what we're finding, interestingly enough, is that the results are coming back much younger than they're supposed to be. So that's something that we're continuing to work on, continuing to put out there. You can find a few references to this kind of stuff online. But John, any comments about carbon-14 dating?
Yeah, you may remember that professor I referred to, the professor of ancient Middle Eastern semantics. I asked him about carbon-14, and I said, okay, now, would you use carbon-14 to date this thing? And he said, well, we could, but we don't. He said it's not being used much anymore at all because here's what we've found. If we had a choice between a carbon-14 date and an actual document, we've discovered the document is far more reliable than the carbon-14, right? The carbon-14 can go all over the place, and the further back you go, the more out from real history it gets. So you have as your outline any datable object that's got writing on it that you can associate with a certain period of time, or mentions a certain, in the day when King Uzziah died, right? You wouldn't waste your time carbon-14 dating the original of that, because you've got it written as a date in terms of an event. And so he said, given the choice, carbon-14 or a document, we'll go for the document every time. So recalibrate it. No, they don't even bother anymore, because you get to get this far out from real history, the further back you go. But the closer you get to the present, the more reliable it becomes, because it's actually a short life isotope. So when you are dealing with something 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 400 years ago, it's moderately reliable. But when you're dealing with 2000, 5000 or whatever dates they want, it becomes further and further away from the truth because of the methodology. And sadly, we have to admit that with all of these datings, it is Charles Lyell's ideas that still reign as king over all the earth in their thinking. My aim is to get rid of Moses. So when you want to date Genesis or any of these things, Lyell's aim that gave rise to all the theology, yes, you heard me correctly, all the theology of dating methods is based on the aim of getting rid of the truth of God's word. The world was made in 6 days. Sin came in. Jesus came because of sin. He rose from the dead. And watch out, he's coming back again.
Yeah.
Well,
there's so many problems with the assumptions with C14, and it goes back to, I thought you were going to mention, John, the present is not the key to the past. We don't know what the conditions were, 1,000 years ago, much less 10,000, which is beyond what the Bible teaches. You don't have any measurements of the N14 in the atmosphere and what the rate that it was converted to C14, much less the plants that were eating it and how many plants were there. And it just goes on and on. The assumptions are just so invalid that it's, a general tool for something fairly recent, but beyond that, it's just not accurate. And there's no way to fix it.
No.
In my opinion.
Well, it's about time that we draw things to a close, as we've reached our hour and a half mark. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. I see that Sam has joined us in the chat, who's not feeling very well. So hopefully you'll be well for us next week, Sam. But thank you for all of those who have joined us in the chat and who have asked questions. It's been great to have you here and engaging with us. So we do hope that you will join us next week as we carry on with Creation Conversations. I will be next week. I'll probably be doing next week from our homeschooling convention, so that will be interesting. But yes, we will see you there next week. Anyway, until next time, goodbye, God bless. See you from all of the team, and we will catch you next time. Catch you later.
Goodbye.